Obamacare has failed.
If you have no health insurance and you can't go to a doctor, you die.
The debate over Obamacare. President Trump takes the first steps to repeal it. What will that mean to you?
This is the Emmy Award-winning 11 News Close-Up with your host, Marvin Scott.
Good morning, everyone. Affordable health care for all Americans. It was President Obama's signature piece of legislation that's come to be known as Obamacare. Now, since its implementation, it has enabled 20 million Americans to gain some form of health insurance. And from the outset, the Republicans have been critical of the law, claiming it is flawed. Now, President Trump has made good on a campaign promise. Just hours after he was sworn in as the 45th president, he signed an executive order to begin repealing and replacing Obamacare. Now, there is much confusion surrounding the president's action and just how it will affect the millions of people who have benefited from Obamacare. To help us sort it all out, I'm pleased to have with us Betsy McCoy, the former lieutenant governor of New York State and author of Beating Obamacare. James Talon is president of the United Hospital Fund of New York, speaking on his own, not on behalf of the hospitals. Good to have you with us.
Thank
I know
you.
There's so much passion surrounding this whole controversy. Betsy, you and I have talked about this so many times, and I know you've read every single page of the 2,572.
Just so everybody can see how big this law is.
Oh my God, I can see it's worn and torn. You've read it many times. And James, I know you take the opposite position because you see the benefits of the current law. So I'd like to use this opportunity in this program to understand, because many people are still confused, like to understand and talk about the pros and cons. And let's begin by finding out just what it was. Explain what President Trump's action means to all of us.
That's right. It's very important. Last Friday, he signed his very first executive order. It will relieve some of the economic burdens imposed by the regulations associated with Obamacare until Congress can act. The president doesn't have the power by himself to repeal a law, but he does have within the executive branch discretion to suspend or waive some of the penalties. For example, right now there are about 10 million people incurring penalties for not having Obamacare compliant insurance. The penalties are big now, Marvin. It's $995 on average for an adult, and then $500 for each of your uninsured children.
Because it's
so
under
that
the law,
really
it's
whacks
imperative
you.
to have insurance.
Exactly. So he said, why should we be continuing to impose these penalties when premiums have doubled nationwide since 2013? And in a third of the counties around the United States, there's only one choice. This law guaranteed affordability and choice, and it hasn't delivered. That doesn't mean we shouldn't cover the 20 million people, but we've got 220 million people who are getting clobbered by this law, and we want to provide relief for them as well.
So basically what he did, it's a stopgap while they're exploring a replacement for that. Do you,
That's right.
do you agree with that interpretation, Jim?
Well, I think the president's executive order was somewhat vague in terms of what its impact was going to be. It clearly indicated that the federal agencies were to take the least vigorous approach to enforcing it. Some of the interpretation is that that would mean that people didn't have to pay the penalty. I think that some of the commentary on it was unclear whether that's precisely what it said. The agencies themselves, the Health and Human Services, the Internal Revenue Service, would have to act to actually implement any of those changes that he outlined.
But this is going to be a long process, but this was just setting the wheels in motion, basically.
And putting Congress on a faster timetable, because you heard Speaker Paul Ryan, for example, say just weeks ago, oh, we're going to take months to work this out. And Donald Trump said, no, you're not, because some people in America really need relief. For example, here's a list of 400 employers who have cut the hours for their part-time workers. Some of them are people in your viewing area of New Jersey people, Union Community College, telling its adjuncts and temporary workers, you can't work more than 30 hours anymore because then we'd have to get you insurance. So there are people around the country who are getting clobbered by this law, and if we can suspend some of those negative impacts, there are 220 million people who are losing out one way or another. And it's just not fair. 20 million are getting covered, but 10 times that many are getting hurt. We can do both. We can help those who are getting hurt without abandoning those who need insurance.
I mean, President Trump said, quote, he has terrific ideas to change.
And he does.
I want to explore some of that later.
Okay.
And I know you have spoken with
I
President
have,
Trump because
and the first thing he said to me on the phone was, I made a promise to cover people, to protect people with pre-existing conditions. Let's talk about how to do that.
Okay,
he is absolutely intent on doing that.
Want to explore more
Yes.
about that conversation and what that replacement is going to be, but I'd like to begin with the two of you. And I know we can do a whole program just talking about the pros from your point of view, Betsy, but I'd like to...
The cons.
If
Jim's
we
the
could
expert on the pros.
Get the pros and cons. Cons. We'll talk about... Let's start with you. Let's talk about pros and cons.
Okay.
Can you do it succinctly?
Yes, okay.
Okay.
I'm concerned about two things. The impact on those who already had insurance, right? For example, someone who had insurance and now they have to buy the Obamacare compliant plan. Suddenly they have a $6,000 deductible under the bronze plan. They're technically covered, but they can't cobble together enough cash to see a doctor. We've got 155 million people in employer-provided coverage. That's where most people get their insurance. But suddenly they've seen their deductibles go way up, 37% on average, because now their employer has to provide the Washington Knows Best design plan. It costs more, and employers are getting the money back by saying to their workers, you have to have a higher deductible. So those people are having trouble actually seeing a doctor. And then you've got 55 million seniors, and they're feeling the pinch in their pocketbooks and also when they go to the hospital, because over half this law is paid for with cuts to Medicare. You know, there's a lot of demagoguery going on about the Republicans cutting Medicare, but the Democrats use Medicare as their piggy bank to pay for this law.
Okay. Those are the cons.
Yes.
Let's hear some of the pros from
Good.
Jim.
Go for
Marvin,
it.
let's just go back to 2000.
Why keep the current law?
Let's just go back to 2008, and why did we do this as a country? Why did President Obama think that this was going to be a signature effort and that he needed to move forward with it? We had 55 million people with no insurance coverage in the country, and our health care costs were skyrocketing at multiples of the growth in the gross domestic product. Those were the numbers. We're the most expensive health care system in the world, but also we had more than well over 50 million people who had no insurance coverage. And that's why this became such a central piece. And it's really a fairly simple piece of legislation, no matter how many pages it has. What it essentially said is we have employer-sponsored coverage, as Betsy indicates, for 155 million people. It did not make a change in that 155 million people. People kept their employer-sponsored coverage. People have Medicare. It didn't take any Medicare away from anybody. In fact, it made some improvements in Medicare. It eliminated the so-called donut hole in which people had to pay more for their own drugs. So for most people, it didn't have an effect. It simply said, we're going to raise the eligibility for the Medicaid program, the federal state program, up to 138% of the poverty level. That's about $33,000 income for a family of four. And the law basically said that was going to be a uniform standard across the country. The Supreme Court came back and said, no, that has to be done state by state, and 31 states have adopted that standard. It then put a private insurance market, it set a private insurance market on top of the Medicare eligibility where people would buy a comprehensive insurance policy, one that had the benefits that you want to have in an insurance policy, and your premium would be subsidized up to 400% of the poverty level. So really, it's those two things. What do we do with the Medicaid expansion? And does repeal mean that we're going to give up that Medicaid expansion? Or what do we do with the marketplace insurance on top that was built on top of it? These are really the two simple features of the law, no matter how many pages it had.
All right, Betsy's just shaking her head. Before we go to a break, let's get your response.
I'd like to address three things. Number one is it did affect Medicare. For example, Section 3001 of this law awards bonus points to hospitals that spend the least per senior. It's called value-based purchasing. But in fact, it's had a very negative impact because when you reward hospitals for spending less per senior, the seniors get less care. And we have a lot of evidence now that those seniors are not recovering from illnesses that they did recover from in other hospitals. The lowest spending hospitals have higher mortality rates for those seniors. So they're losing their lives because of that kind of incentive.
Okay. On that note, we have to take a break.
Right.
We heard the pros and cons, we heard all the arguments. After the break, let's talk about your conversation with President Trump and also what we can expect in the repeal. And then talk to these folks out here who are insured and they're worried right now.
They're worried.
What should they do? We'll explore all that and more when Pix 11 News Close-Up continues. Stay with us. This morning, we're talking about the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, and the Trump administration's efforts to repeal it and replace it. And we have the former Lieutenant Governor of New York State, Betsy McCoy, who's also written the book, Beating Obamacare, and James Talon is president of the United Hospital Fund of New York. Let's continue the conversation. Betsy, you told us before that you had a long conversation with President Trump.
He did. He called me on the phone as I was sitting at my computer writing one of my columns, healthcare columns, and he said to me, I made a promise to protect people with pre-existing conditions. What's the best way to do it? And that's exactly what we talked about, because one of the problems with Obamacare is it puts into the same risk pool very sick people and healthy people. And it requires that the healthy people pay the same price for insurance as the sick people. But on average, 5% of the population uses 50% of the health care. It's very skewed, so that a sick person uses on average 10 times as much as a healthy person. And when you make the healthy people pay the same price, they say, oh, it's like trying to feed a Chihuahua on a Great Dane on the same budget.
In there, Jim.
But sick people aren't the enemy.
They're not the enemy, but we want to pay for them with tax dollars instead of foisting the cost.
The issue here is whether or not people who have pre-existing conditions, and probably a quarter of the people have some form of pre-existing condition, that in the past, back before Obamacare, the insurance companies would charge more to those individuals or they would deny them insurance coverage. That's why we created in the marketplace under Obamacare a broadly based policy that covered all 10 essential elements that needed to be in a comprehensive insurance policy. And the idea was essentially to build an insurance pool that represented the range of risk of people. The law actually said
it's a big ripoff for the young, and that's why they're not buying it, because they know that they shouldn't be paying 10 times what their own health care needs are.
What about the insurance companies? They're a monopoly, and look how the rates have skyrocketed.
They have, because of this. It's the single biggest reason that premiums have doubled since the end of 2013 is this rule that everybody sick and healthy have to pay the same. The healthy refused. They said, this is a raw deal for us.
Jim, you got to learn. Right? When debating with Betsy, you got to jump in on this.
The whole issue.
The Republicans want to pay for the sick people, fully pay for their insurance plans, but pay for it with tax dollars so it's spread across the whole nation instead of victimizing the small number of people, young people who are in the individual market. They can't afford it.
No, let's go to
This
Jim.
isn't about the Republicans trying to spend more money on the healthcare system. Let's go back and remember the reason we have health insurance is to cover people who occasionally have illness or who have serious illness. We try to create a pool. It's why we have employer-sponsored coverage where people with their employer can represent a broad distribution of risk. There is no point in having the health insurance industry sell insurance to healthy people. That may make a good buck for the insurance industry, but it's not the reason we have health insurance coverage.
It's exactly. The point is that once you're very sick, your costs are predictable. And instead of going into an insurance pool, the state should be able to fully cover the costs of your care so that young, healthy people can buy insurance at affordable rates. And that's what they did before.
And this idea is called a high-risk pool. And what it says is we're going to segment out those people. And remember, we're not talking 5%. We're talking anybody who has a cancer, who has mental illness, who may have a substance abuse problem.
According to the House Energy Committee, under Henry Waxman, it's 5%. 500,000 people were covered under the state high-risk pools and the federal high-risk pool. That was the number total who needed coverage before Obamacare.
And the state high-risk pool is going to put all of those people, each of the states is going to run a pool for the most expensive people at the same time that Washington is cutting back money on the Medicaid program. And at the same time...
Okay.
We've already figured out what it's going to cost, and the fact is it's a fairer way to care for the sick without imposing the burden on young people who can't afford their coverage. My son-in-law has a $6,000 deductible. He said, Mom, I can't afford to go to the doctor. I'm never going to meet that deductible.
I think the important thing to understand, I mean, we hear all the figures, the statistics here. How will it affect those people out here watching right now, our viewers, all those others who have insurance, didn't have insurance prior to Obamacare?
They'll see their premiums go way down. That's the key here. We want the premiums to drop because, as Jim said, some people are subsidized, but if you make more than $46,000, you don't get any subsidy, and it's not affordable insurance anymore.
There's two things that are going to happen under the repeal. And first, I think we would understand this is a big deal. The Congressional Budget Office said 20 million people lose coverage in the first year.
Totally phony number. I'll tell you why it's phony.
Well,
Let me just stop right there. The Congressional Budget Office analyzed what would happen if Congress repealed the law but didn't replace it. That's like saying to a surgeon, what's going to happen to your patient when you remove his heart but don't give him a
Betsy,
transplant?
I've got to get to this before the time we have left. I want to talk about, I know you spoke to the president and you've read all 2,700 pages. He hasn't, I guess. But what recommendations are made? Right now, what he's done, the executive order is a stopgap while they look for a replacement of Obamacare. What
because he did that executive order and because he actually sent the signal that people may not have to pay the penalty that's built into the Internal Revenue Act, the clock is now ticking. And this idea that there's somehow going to be a repeal vote and then followed by some sort of replacement, this is a big deal.
Is there anything that can
Let me assure viewers that it's going to
you,
happen, even if the laws aren't passed simultaneously, the effective date for repeal and replacement will be the same.
Is there anything you could see in there, Jim, for replacement? Any portions of Obamacare that you see can be replaced?
All that I would say is
flawed, isn't it? There are portions.
I think adjustments can be made. There may need to be adjustments in the subsidy. There may need to be adjustments in the way in which the rates are calculated. But working with it and not essentially saying that we're going to come up to the 2018 cycle and say that people don't have to pay the penalty or buy coverage, the insurance companies are going to pull away from the market. So the Congress is going to have to act here. The first thing I hope it does is it looks at the Medicaid program, which is a fundamental core of this Obamacare expansion.
Medicare is not going anywhere.
Well, Medicare is going to be changed into a block grant under this proposal. And it's the reason that Governor Cuomo pointed out that in New York, we're exposed for 2.7 million people losing insurance coverage if this is repealed.
They're not going to lose it.
I think that's an important question. Are the folks who are currently insured now,
under
Obamacare, are they going to lose their insurance?
They're not going to lose their coverage. And by the way, block granting Medicaid to the states will ensure that the care is delivered more effectively. Because right now, Medicaid spending is soaring. But the studies show that we're not seeing enough improvement
Medicaid
in the
spending in New York isn't soaring at all.
I'm talking about the national numbers.
It's been under a cap for all of the years of the Cuomo administration.
Let me just explain. We want better outcomes. We want to see improvement in health.
Let me ask you this.
Yes.
Since we're getting a wrap, give you both a couple of seconds. Just give me a final thought.
If it's a good plan, you shouldn't have to coerce people and penalize them when they don't buy it. And that's the number one issue. No more penalties. If you provide a good plan and it's affordable, people will want to buy it.
You ought to have a comprehensive insurance policy. You shouldn't get a stripped-down catastrophic policy that then says you pay for it out of your own dollars in a health savings account. That's one of the proposals.
Washington knows best, but they don't really.
And you shouldn't cut the state's reimbursement under the Medicaid program. That is a big deal, a multi-billion-dollar deal for New York, which could blow up our budget discussions.
I think as our viewers got the idea that the debate is not going anywhere. It's going to continue for a while, and it's going to be a while before we see any kind of changes.
I think the change is going to come very quickly by the 2018 cycle because Donald Trump has promised people lower premiums.
I think we will agree that the clock is ticking.
Yes.
If you're going to start to repeal this legislation, then you've got to lay out what else is. This is really one of the biggest things that's happened in American healthcare. You just can't make it go away and then think you'll get an agreement on how to replace it. I would keep the Affordable Care Act and work with it to make it better.
James Dallin, Betsy McCoy.
Let's debate again.
I love that, Betsy.
I'm sure we'll have another program talking about this. Thanks so much for joining us. And we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about Donald Trump, the president's first week in office. We'll be right back. It certainly has been a whirlwind first week in office for President Donald Trump, wasting no time at all fulfilling some of his campaign promises and stirring up even more controversy with his off-the-cuff remarks and his strained relations with the news media. He did set in motion the wheels to repeal Obamacare, as we heard, took initial steps to build that wall along the Mexican border, and imposed new restrictions on immigration. Morgan Peckma has been providing us with political analysis since Donald Trump first launched his campaign many, many months ago, and joins me now to take a look at his first week in office as president. Morgan is the executive director of the think tank Effective New York and host of the radio program Effective New York on 970 AM. Okay, it's been a week, and we're really trying to keep up with Donald Trump, all of his executive orders. First, for your impression of his inaugural address. He said the thing that resonated, America first. Is that seems to be resonating with the American people. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, the media reported that it was a very divisive speech, that it didn't look past look at our proud history and try to unify the country like inaugural addresses usually do, and it was more playing to his base. He certainly struck a fervently nationalist tone, which is problematic in our globalist world, but he has been, if nothing, consistent in his inconsistency.
He's fulfilling his promises on the campaign. I mean, he touched the nerve of the voters across this country, and he's acting immediately on the things he promised. Obamacare, also the immigration and building that wall.
Well, there's been a lot of symbolism in his moves so far. It's not clear whether his actions will necessarily pass legal muster, what he really intends to do to actualize his promises. Everything that he's talked about so far is problematic and immensely complicated to implement. So, you know, right now he is certainly fulfilling his campaign promises, at least in speech, but whether he can do so indeed, you know, that's another question.
Now, that wall is stirring a lot of controversy. Can he do that without Congress behind him and the funding, the billions of dollars it's going to take to build that?
No, he cannot. Congress appropriates money for, you know, that's the principal job of Congress is appropriations. And there are a lot of problems. For instance, all the border of Texas, for the most part, is privately owned land. Are you going to take that away from private citizens? There are a lot of complications in building the wall, and it is an immensely expensive undertaking.
Let's talk about what he's done for immigration and how it's going to impact the sanctuary cities of immigrants who are here illegally. He wants to get them removed.
This should be something that's really troubling to all New Yorkers, because we could lose somewhere between hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding, or even up to $7 billion, according to some estimates. That would be absolutely calamitous for New York City, and we've seen a whole bunch of cutbacks that could deeply affect both New York State and New York City. So,
but also about closing off to Muslims from countries which have supported terrorism, holding them back from coming into this country.
Yes. You know, he has basically, pointed to a number of Muslim countries and said that he will not allow.
Now, he can enact this
countries
without the approval of Congress?
You know, all of this has been done, kind of flying by the seat of his pants, right? We've seen that the orders around opening up these black sites where torture could occur with the CIA, the head of the CIA and the head of the Department of Defense, they were unaware that this was going to go through. To move so aggressively forward with the agenda, it's not very clear whether they've been actually thinking through the logistics of how all these things could be done.
Now, he's also taken action on something that the Obama administration had canceled on the Keystone pipeline. He wants to have that resumed. That'll create, he says, 28,000 jobs. He wants the steel that be steel that's made in America.
Well, there's a lot of, other thinking about the facts here, as is often the case with Trump. Some people say it will create less than 50 jobs. I think this is going to be a point of an immediate conflict. We've already seen how spirited the protests have been around the Keystone pipeline, and I just hope that lives are not lost and that we can satisfy or resolve that situation with as peaceably as possible.
Okay, it's been a heck of a week. His first week in office, his second week in office, he's promised to name his appointee for the Supreme Court. He's down to three federal judges. Any thoughts on that?
I think you're going to see a very conservative justice who will tip the balance of the court even farther to the right than it was when Judge Scalia was still alive, and it will infuriate people on the left.
Okay, we should have the answer to that in the next couple of days. Morgan Peckma, thank you so much.
Thank you, Marvin.
And that'll do it for our program for this week. If you have any questions or wish to see this broadcast again, log on to our website at pix11.com/News Closeup. I'm Marvin Scott. Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, everyone.